All right, so I'm speaking on family income and academic achievement, or test scores, in other words. So there are some recent really important findings on the income achievement gap in the United States. And by income achievement gap, I mean the difference in test scores between students from high and low income families. So we're focusing on test scores, on education, in this presentation, in contrast with what we've seen this morning. The story that we kind of tell ourselves in the United States, at least historically, is that we might have a weaker social safety net, we might do fewer transfers at that point in the life cycle, but we historically have had a more equalized education system. So less of the between-school, very rigid academic and vocational tracking that you sometimes see in European countries. And one of the first countries to have universal primary education, later secondary and post-secondary education. And now recently we have a lot better data also on test scores. And so this helps us get a handle on the experiences that children are having in school, the learning and development of their literacy and numeracy skills, to kind of get at, is this story that we tell ourselves really true? That we may have high inequality in other areas of life, but education is sort of our great equalizer. So you can probably guess where my conclusions are going here. So this is why the income achievement gap is important. And recent evidence from the United States shows not only is this gap bigger than we'd like to see here domestically, but it also appears to be growing. So between cohorts born in the mid-1970s and the early 2000s, it looks like the income achievement gap in the US has grown about 40%. And of course, we know during this same time period, income inequality grew really sharply. But these results haven't too much been put in an international context yet. And when we're focusing just on the domestic data, there are a few questions that are raised that we can't fully answer. So whether income inequality is sort of directly driving this gap through high-income students being sort of better off in absolute terms and low-income students being worse off, or whether the processes that connect the two are a little more complicated than that, happening through other kind of correlates to income inequality like neighborhood segregation, and also what role does the school system play in the income achievement gap. And so to try to answer these questions, we turn to international evidence, and specifically, we're asking the questions, how does the income achievement gap vary across wealthy countries? And how does the US kind of rank or compare relative to other countries? And then last, trying to look at some explanations for the variation that we see across countries in income achievement gaps. So predicted by income inequality itself, as well as other characteristics of national education systems and social welfare systems. So first I'm gonna focus on what we find for the first two questions, just kind of descriptively what income achievement gaps look like across countries, how much they vary, and where the US falls. So the data that we use come mostly from international assessments, a couple of big ones. PEARLS, which happens at the elementary school level for 4th grade, and PISA, which happens in secondary school for 15-year-olds. So we have the US and 19 other wealthy OECD countries. And then for each of the studies that we have access to, we construct estimates of income achievement gaps between, or achievement gaps between the 90th and 10th income percentiles of each country's specific income distribution in all of the different years and subjects that we have. So the first thing that I'm gonna show you is just to get a picture of what these results look like, just the income achievement gaps for the subject of reading. And so here we have each dot is a gap. So, and the gaps are oriented, the scale is oriented horizontally. So the farther to the right a country is, the bigger the difference in achievement between high income and low income students. Measured in standard deviations of scores on the test. And the brackets around each dot are just 95% confidence intervals, so just showing how much uncertainty is associated with each of our estimates of gaps. So the first grouping of countries you see is elementary school, and then the next three groups are all secondary school, grouped by year, And so the first thing to really notice here is that there is a lot of variation. Notwithstanding the uncertainty that I talked about a minute ago, there seem to be some countries that really have huge differences between the 90th and 10th income percentiles in achievement on tests. So up to almost 1.5 standard deviations in reading, down to, at the lower end, less than half of a standard deviation in reading scores between high and low income students. And the second thing to notice, aside from just the huge international variation, is where the US ranks. So, this seems that this story that we've sort of told ourselves about having a relatively equal school system despite inequality in other areas really doesn't seem to hold up here. So as in a lot of the other sets that we've seen this morning, the US ranks among the most unequal countries in test scores as well. So comparable in size to the much dissed Luxembourg and Portugal and a couple other European countries, Belgium and Hungary, are similar to the US in terms of size of income achievement gaps. And then some of the countries with the lowest achievement gaps tend to be Nordic countries, so Iceland, Norway, Sweden. Also Poland looks relatively equitable here. So that's descriptively where countries rank. And now I'm gonna talk a bit about trying to explain all this variation in terms of income inequality and other characteristics. So the first three explanations I'm gonna look at have to do with poverty and inequality. So we'll first look directly at income inequality and then a couple other country characteristics that tend to be pretty strongly correlated with income inequality. School income segregation and child poverty rates. So in these graphs, now the gaps are oriented vertically, so the higher a country is, the larger the difference in achievement between high and low income students. And then income inequality is along the horizontal axis. And the size of the bubbles just corresponds to the precision that we estimated the gaps at. So larger bubbles we're more certain about. And so here we see a relatively strong association between income inequality and, oh, sorry, on the vertical axis, that's income achievement gaps. But it's not a perfect association. So there's a lot of scatter around the line here. And while the United States is sort of high on both, there are also a few other countries like Luxembourg and Belgium that have only moderately high income inequality, but still very high income achievement gaps. And countries like Poland that has moderately high income inequality, but a relatively low income achievement gap. So this doesn't perfectly correlate with the size of income achievement gaps. So next we look at income segregation between schools. And here we find a little bit stronger relationship. So it does appear to be the case, even slightly more strongly or more definitively than just with income inequality, that countries that have greater separation of students of different income groups into different schools tend to have some of the larger income achievement gaps. The US, again, having, among the countries we look at, the highest level of income segregation among schools, and also a large income achievement gap. And then last, we look at child poverty rates. So among these countries, for children specifically, the US has the highest poverty rate at over 20%. And we also see, as expected, a positive relationship here. Countries that have more children living in poverty have higher income achievement gaps and vice versa. So that's the first three measures of poverty and inequality. We'll also look at two other characteristics in terms of adverse kind of health outcomes that tend to be associated with income inequality, the rate of babies being born with low birth weight and the teen childbearing rate. Both of these also we expect to be positively related with the size of income achievement gaps, and we also find this, although the relationships are a bit weaker, so I'm not gonna show those graphs here, but also they are in the expected directions. The next things that we look at are policies to kind of, through government action, through state action, to sort of address the amount of poverty and inequality present in society. So we look at two sort of classes of policies here. We look at social welfare policies, things like public health expenditures, public spending on family benefits, and we also look at parental support, so specifically support around parental leave after childbirth. So for both of these, we expect negative relationships, that countries that have more social welfare policies or parental support policies in place should have smaller income achievement gaps for their school children. And we do find this, although the relationships are quite weak. But we think that this might have something to do with a lot of these policies in the cross-national data are a bit difficult to measure and quantify. So it may be a weakness of kind of some of the measures that we're using there. So then to move into the third class of policies that are maybe slightly easier to measure, education policies, and sort of most directly pertaining to test scores. We look at two different types of education policies. So educational differentiation, which we measure according to the enrollment rate in private schooling, and then a few other variables that have to do with this kind of European style between school academic and vocational tracking that I mentioned earlier. So basically trying to summarize the degree to which students are exposed to very different educational experiences, particularly having to do with the kind of orientation of the curriculum they follow. And then last, a measure of curricular standardization. So educational differentiation should be associated, we think, probably with higher, larger income achievement gaps. Whereas standardization, the idea that through nationally standardized exit exam for secondary schooling, there should be some more equalization of the quality and the curriculum of schooling should be associated, we think, with lower income achievement gaps. So both of these relationships do seem to hold up in the data. Countries with greater levels of educational differentiation do tend to have higher income achievement gaps. The US bucks this trend a little bit with, at least as we measure it here, relatively low educational differentiation and still a high income achievement gap. But the other countries do tend on average to follow this trend. And then last, our measure of curricular standardization, so the proportion of students taking nationally centralized exit exams, as we expected, tends to be associated with a smaller size in income achievement gaps. So countries like the United States, where fewer students are required to take any kind of national exam to finish high school, tend to be the countries that have the highest income achievement gaps. So I apologize for showing the first regression table of the day, but the message here is pretty similar to all of the just bivariate relationships I showed before. So all of these policies obviously have pretty strong correlations, some stronger than others, with each other. And so this model just tries to account in a multivariate way for those intercorrelations. But we still find for the three types of measures that were strongest before, poverty and inequality seems to be associated with even sort of controlling for other factors with larger income achievement gaps, educational differentiation also with larger achievement gaps, and standardization with smaller gaps. And then the other two policies that are maybe a little less reliably measured are not significantly associated with income achievement gaps. So in conclusion, we find suggestive evidence that poverty and inequality, different aspects of it are associated with the size of the gap. And not just sort of explicitly income inequality, but especially some of the other correlates of income inequality, like school segregation. We also find for non-educational social policies, not very strong relationships with gaps, although they may be not too precisely measured. And also suggestive evidence that features of the K-12 schooling system, particularly differentiation and standardization that we measure, seem to be associated with the size of the gap. So we think that, that these income achievement gaps that we've been observing that are particularly high in the United States seem to be associated probably partially with the amount of poverty and inequality present in society, but that some countries, particularly those with low levels of differentiation and at the same time high levels of standardization, seem to have successfully minimized test score differences between high and low income students. And so we would suggest that, that education policy is another realm where income inequality can be addressed, and that the idea of schooling being a great equalizer seems to not be borne out by the data that we show here. Thank you.